Sometimes the hardest place to hide your heart is right beside the person who has always felt like home. That was the thought circling Ethan Carter's mind as his aging pickup truck rolled down a narrow gravel road beneath an endless Montana sky, the late afternoon sun painting the hills in warm shades of gold. 3 weeks earlier, he had been living in Seattle, juggling freelance wildlife photography jobs that had slowly disappeared after a major magazine canceled several assignments. Rent had become impossible, savings had nearly vanished, and for the first time since college, he had no idea what came next. Then his phone rang. Mason Brooks, his best friend of almost 8 years, had called with an offer so simple it sounded almost unreal. "Come work at the ranch for the summer," Mason had said. "I could use an extra pair of hands, and honestly, it'd be good to have you around." Ethan had laughed, pretending it sounded like an easy decision, but the truth was far more complicated. Mason wasn't just his oldest friend. He was also the one person Ethan had quietly loved for longer than he cared to admit. A love he had carefully folded away, year after year, like a letter never meant to be mailed. Losing Mason's friendship had always seemed far more frightening than never being loved back. So Ethan packed his camera, 2 duffel bags, and every secret he had promised himself would remain buried forever. As the familiar wooden entrance sign reading Brooks Family Ranch appeared beside the road, memories rushed back without permission. Summers spent fishing in the creek after college. Long nights watching meteor showers from the pasture. Birthday barbecues. Countless conversations that lasted until sunrise. Mason had unknowingly become part of every memory Ethan treasured most. The ranch looked exactly as Ethan remembered it. White fences stretched across rolling fields. Horses wandered peacefully beneath cottonwood trees, and the large red barn stood proudly against distant mountains that seemed almost painted onto the horizon. Before Ethan had fully parked, the front door of the farmhouse opened. Mason stepped outside wearing worn blue jeans, dusty boots, and a faded baseball cap. He looked older than the last time Ethan had seen him 6 months earlier, his shoulders broader from years of hard work, but his smile remained exactly the same. Warm, effortless, familiar. "About time," Mason called with an easy grin as he walked over and pulled Ethan into a quick hug. "You drive slower than my grandfather." Ethan laughed, grateful Mason couldn't hear how much faster his own heartbeat had suddenly become. "I wanted to enjoy the scenery." "Liar. You got lost. Only twice." Mason chuckled and grabbed one of the duffel bags before Ethan could protest. "Good. Means you still need me." Those 4 words settled somewhere deep inside Ethan's chest. They walked toward the farmhouse talking about ordinary things. Weather, broken fences, new horses, local diners. Everything except the years that had quietly changed them both. The conversation flowed as naturally as it always had, and for a brief moment Ethan convinced himself that maybe spending one summer here would help him finally move on. Maybe seeing Mason every day would somehow erase feelings that had survived nearly a decade. Dinner passed with homemade chili, fresh cornbread, and stories about stubborn cattle escaping fences. They laughed until sunset painted the kitchen windows orange. It almost felt unfair how easy everything still was between them. After washing the dishes, Mason rubbed the back of his neck and suddenly looked unusually uncomfortable. "So there's one thing." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound promising." Mason sighed before letting out a small laugh. "Yesterday's storm knocked a huge pine tree onto the guest cabin. Bad. Roof's gone. Contractors can't get here until next week." Ethan nodded slowly. "Okay." Mason hesitated another second before pointing upstairs. "Which means there's only one room ready tonight." Ethan felt his stomach tighten before Mason finished the sentence with a sheepish smile. "If you don't mind, we're going to have to share my bed." Ethan forced a small smile that he hoped looked natural. "It is your house," he said lightly. "I think I can survive sharing a room for a few nights." Mason looked visibly relieved. "I promise I snore less than I used to." "That is a bold claim. You will find out in about an hour." They both laughed, and the tension dissolved just enough for Ethan to breathe again. He followed Mason upstairs, carrying the second duffel bag, while quietly reminding himself that this was only temporary. The bedroom was simple and comfortable, with weathered wooden walls, a wide window overlooking the pastures, and family photographs lining a bookshelf. Ethan immediately noticed one picture taken years earlier at Yellowstone National Park. The two of them stood shoulder to shoulder, younger, sunburned, smiling as though life could never become complicated. Mason caught him looking. I never took that one down. Ethan smiled softly. I remember that trip. You got us lost for 6 hours. Mason laughed. We found the trail eventually. Only because an 8-year-old handed you the map upside down. I have spent years trying to forget that. The easy conversation made everything feel familiar again. Mason tossed an extra pillow onto the bed before opening the closet. I cleared out half the space for you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Half? Fine. 40%. Honesty looks good on you. They unpacked while talking about ordinary things. Mason described the ranch schedule, explaining that mornings started before sunrise because the horses always seemed to know exactly when breakfast was late. Ethan admitted he had forgotten how quiet the countryside could be compared to Seattle. Outside, crickets had already replaced the distant traffic he had grown used to hearing every night. When they finally turned off the lights, moonlight spilled across the room through the uncovered window. Ethan lay on one side of the bed, carefully leaving more than enough space between them. Mason stretched comfortably on his back, completely unaware of the emotional gymnastics happening only inches away. Long day. Once. One canceled project became 2. Then 3. Eventually, I spent more time sending emails than taking photographs. You should not have gone through that alone. I was managing. Mason was quiet before replying. You do not always have to. Those words lingered in the silence. Ethan wanted to answer with everything he had kept hidden for years, but instead he simply whispered, "Thanks." The room grew still again. Somewhere outside, a horse let out a gentle snort, followed by the steady rhythm of insects filling the warm summer night. Ethan wondered if Mason had already fallen asleep. Hey, Mason suddenly said. Do you ever think about how weird it is that we met because you accidentally joined the wrong college hiking club? Ethan laughed under his breath. It was not the wrong club. It definitely was. You were looking for the photography group. And somehow, I ended up climbing a mountain with strangers. Best mistake either of us ever made. Ethan closed his eyes, letting those words settle deep inside him. Best mistake. Mason probably meant the friendship that had followed, but Ethan could not help wishing, just for a second, that the sentence meant something more. The next morning arrived long before sunrise. Ethan woke to the smell of fresh coffee drifting upstairs and the faint sound of country music playing somewhere below. He got dressed quickly and stepped outside into crisp morning air that carried the scent of pine trees and fresh hay. The ranch looked entirely different beneath the first light of day. Golden sunlight stretched across the fields while horses wandered peacefully through the pasture. Mason stood by the fence-filling water troughs with practiced efficiency. He looked over, grinned, and tossed Ethan a pair of worn leatherwork gloves. Ethan caught them with one hand. You really start this early every day? Mason shrugged. The animals do not believe in sleeping late. Ethan pulled on the gloves and walked over. What is first? Mason rested both arms on the fence and looked toward the eastern pasture where several sections of fencing leaned at odd angles after the recent storm. First, we fix what the wind tried to steal. After that, I will show you why I never managed to leave this place. Ethan followed Mason across the dew-covered grass, unaware that this ordinary morning was quietly laying the foundation for everything that would change before summer came to an end. By the end of the first week, Ethan could almost convince himself that life had always belonged on the ranch. The early mornings no longer felt impossible. His hands had grown accustomed to rough wooden fences and worn leather reins, and every evening ended with the quiet satisfaction that came from honest work. There was something calming about the steady rhythm of the place. Problems were measured in broken gates, stubborn horses, unexpected rain, or machinery that refused to start. None of them felt as complicated as the thoughts Ethan had carried with him from Seattle. Mason noticed the change before Ethan did. You smiled more this week than you did the entire time you were packing your truck, he remarked one evening while they stacked hay bales inside the barn. Ethan brushed dust from his shirt and laughed. Maybe I just forgot what it feels like to sleep without checking my email every 5 minutes. Good, Mason replied. Keep forgetting. The words sounded simple, yet Ethan held on to them longer than he should have. Saturday arrived with the annual planning meeting for the Willow Creek Summer Harvest Festival, an event the entire county seemed to treat as seriously as a national holiday. Mason insisted Ethan come along, promising free barbecue and homemade pie if nothing else. The town hall buzzed with cheerful conversations, children running between folding chairs, and neighbors greeting one another by name. Ethan quickly remembered why Mason loved this community. People genuinely looked out for one another. Near the front of the room, the festival coordinator, an energetic woman named Linda Harper, reviewed this year's schedule. Local farms would host visitors, artisans would demonstrate traditional crafts, and several ranches would compete for a community development grant designed to promote agritourism. When Linda reached Mason's name, she smiled broadly. Brooks Family Ranch has always been one of our biggest attractions. Mason nodded politely. We are happy to help. Linda continued. This year the promotional campaign focuses on family-owned ranches and the people behind them. Visitors love authentic stories. She flipped through a folder before stopping unexpectedly. According to the preliminary paperwork, we still need confirmation regarding your registered household partnership for the featured couple presentation. Mason blinked. My what? Linda frowned slightly. The featured couple category. Every participating ranch must designate the pair representing daily ranch life for interviews, photographs, and community events. Mason exchanged a confused glance with Ethan before quietly asking, Can that not just be me? Linda offered an apologetic smile. Normally, yes, but the tourism board adjusted the rules this year. They want visitors to connect with relationships, family traditions, and shared stories. Couples receive priority consideration for the largest grant package. Mason rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. I was not aware of that. The deadline is Monday morning, Linda replied. Otherwise, the Brooks Ranch moves into the standard exhibition category. On the drive home, silence filled the truck. Mason kept both hands on the steering wheel, while Ethan watched miles of open pasture slide past the window. Finally, Mason sighed. That grant would pay for replacing the north barn roof and repairing the irrigation system. Ethan looked over. How much are we talking about? Enough that I have been hoping for it all year. Ethan nodded slowly. Then you will find another way. Mason laughed without much confidence. Maybe. They reached the ranch just before sunset. Mason remained sitting in the driver's seat after turning off the engine. This is going to sound ridiculous. Ethan smiled. Most interesting conversations start that way. Mason hesitated before saying, Linda mentioned that the representatives do not actually have to be legally married. They only have to participate as a committed household during the festival program. Ethan looked at him carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading. Mason exhaled. Slowly. Would you consider pretending to be my husband for a couple of weeks? Ethan honestly thought he had misunderstood the question. You are serious? Mason gave an embarrassed laugh. Believe me, I know how insane it sounds. We would just attend interviews, wear matching badges, smile for photographs, and help visitors tour the ranch. After the festival ends, everything goes back to normal. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly he was grateful Mason could not hear it. Every instinct told him to refuse before pretending became too painful, yet another voice quietly reminded him why he had come here in the first place. Mason needed help, and Ethan had never learned how to deny him anything. After several long seconds, Ethan smiled with far more confidence than he actually felt. All right, he said. For the ranch. I will be your fake husband. The following Monday began with far more laughter than either of them expected. Mason drove them into Willow Creek just after breakfast, both wearing clean denim shirts because, according to Linda Harper's email, the promotional photographs needed to reflect the authentic spirit of ranch life. Ethan kept reminding himself that this was simply another job, another favor for his best friend, nothing more. Unfortunately, his heartbeat refused to cooperate with logic. As soon as they walked into the community center, Linda greeted them with an enthusiastic smile. There they are. Our favorite couple. Ethan nearly choked on the coffee he had just taken a sip of, while Mason rubbed the back of his neck with the same embarrassed grin he always wore whenever attention landed on him. We are still getting used to hearing that, Mason admitted. Linda laughed. You will be professionals by the end of the festival. The morning moved quickly. They signed participation forms for the tourism program, reviewed the interview schedule, and received matching name badges. Ethan stared at the printed card in his hand for a second longer than he should have. Beneath his name, one line read, Brooks Family Ranch. Beside him, Mason quietly examined his own badge before giving Ethan a playful nudge. Looks like you have officially been adopted. Ethan smiled. I hope the employee benefits are good. Unlimited homemade pie. That is surprisingly convincing. Their photographer, Daniel, spent the afternoon capturing simple moments around the ranch. None of the poses felt dramatic. They repaired a fence together while laughing over crooked fence posts. They carried feed buckets across the barn. They walked through a sunflower field discussing absolutely nothing important. Every few minutes Daniel encouraged them to stand a little closer because the camera framed them better that way. Ethan could feel himself becoming painfully aware of every inch separating him from Mason. Mason, meanwhile, remained completely relaxed. "Pretend you have done this 1,000 times, Daniel encouraged. Mason laughed. "We have worked together before." "Exactly. Just look at each other the way old partners do." Ethan met Mason's eyes for barely 2 seconds before looking away again. Somehow those 2 seconds felt longer than entire conversations. Later that afternoon, Linda handed each of them a small velvet box. "One more detail," she said cheerfully. Ethan looked inside and froze. 2 simple silver wedding bands rested on soft black fabric. "They are only props," Linda explained. "Visitors notice little things. These help complete the story." Mason picked one up and examined it. "These look surprisingly real." "They are quality replicas," Linda replied. "Most people cannot tell the difference." Ethan suddenly found it difficult to breathe. Wearing a ring should have meant nothing. It was only part of the performance. Yet when Mason casually reached over and held out Ethan's left hand, the entire world seemed to grow strangely quiet. "May I?" Mason asked with an easy smile. Ethan managed a small nod. Mason gently slid the silver band onto Ethan's ring finger. The motion lasted only a second, completely innocent, entirely professional, but something inside Ethan shifted anyway. He looked down at the ring, wondering why such a simple object suddenly felt so impossibly heavy. Ethan returned the gesture, carefully placing the matching band onto Mason's hand. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment before both of them stepped back almost at the same time. "Perfect," Daniel said while lifting his camera. "Stay exactly where you are." The shutter clicked several times as Mason glanced toward Ethan with an effortless smile that looked genuine enough to fool anyone watching. For the first time all day, Ethan realized how dangerous this arrangement could become. Pretending required constant reminders that none of it was real. The smiles were part of the job. The rings were borrowed. The photographs belonged to a marketing campaign. Even the word husband existed only inside a carefully constructed story designed to help save the ranch. Yet reality had an unsettling way of slipping quietly into make-believe. That evening, after returning home, Mason leaned against the porch railing and admired the sunset spreading across the valley. "I have to admit," he said thoughtfully, "today was not nearly as awkward as I expected." Ethan looked at the silver band still resting on his hand before forcing a relaxed smile. "Give it time. We have several more weeks to embarrass ourselves." Mason laughed. "Maybe. Or maybe we are just better at pretending than either of us realized." Ethan looked toward the fading horizon, silently hoping Mason would never discover how difficult pretending had already become. As the festival moved into its busiest week, the line between performance and ordinary life became harder to recognize. Visitors wandered through Brooks' family ranch every morning, eager to learn how horses were trained, how fences were repaired, and why ranch life still held such a special place in rural Montana. Mason welcomed everyone with his easy smile while Ethan answered questions about wildlife photography and the landscapes surrounding the property. Whenever someone referred to them as husbands, Mason answered naturally enough that Ethan sometimes forgot they were acting at all. It was the little moments that unsettled him most. Mason handing him a cold bottle of water before Ethan even realized he was thirsty. Mason brushing hay from Ethan's shoulder without thinking. Mason saving the last slice of homemade blackberry pie because he knew it had always been Ethan's favorite. None of those gestures belonged in a script, yet they happened every single day. One afternoon, while Ethan was photographing a pair of horses near the western pasture, he noticed Mason talking with a woman he had not met before. She looked about their age, wore hiking boots covered in dust, and laughed easily at something Mason had said. Ethan did not intend to stare, but the conversation lasted longer than expected. When Mason waved for him to come over, Ethan slipped his camera back into its bag and walked across the field. "Ethan, this is Rachel Collins," Mason said. "She manages community outreach for the state conservation program." Rachel smiled warmly and offered her hand. I have heard you are the photographer everyone keeps talking about. Your wildlife photos hanging in the visitor barn are incredible. Thank you, Ethan replied politely. Rachel glanced at Mason with an amused expression. He has mentioned your work more than once. Ethan looked toward Mason, who suddenly seemed unusually interested in adjusting the brim of his cap. I might have bragged a little, Mason admitted. Rachel laughed. A little? He practically gave me a gallery tour before introducing himself. Ethan smiled, but something quietly tightened inside his chest. He reminded himself there was absolutely nothing unusual about Mason talking to an attractive woman. In fact, it was probably far more normal than everything else happening this summer. Even so, the thought lingered longer than Ethan wanted to admit. Over the next several days, Rachel visited the ranch multiple times while coordinating conservation projects connected to the tourism initiative. She and Mason often discussed trail maintenance, wildlife habitats, and future grant opportunities. Ethan never interrupted those conversations. Instead, he found reasons to stay busy repairing fences, organizing equipment, or walking farther into the pastures with his camera. He convinced himself he was simply giving Mason space to work. Deep down, he knew he was protecting his own heart. Mason noticed the distance almost immediately. One evening, after the last visitors had left, he found Ethan sitting alone on the porch steps, watching the sunset settle behind the mountains. You disappeared again today, Mason said as he sat beside him. Ethan shrugged casually. There was plenty to do. You have barely spoken to me since Tuesday. That is not true. Mason looked at him carefully. Then tell me what is bothering you. Ethan forced a quiet laugh. Nothing is bothering me. Mason did not answer right away. Instead, he watched the horses grazing peacefully across the field before speaking again. You know, you have never been very good at pretending everything is fine. Ethan stared at the fading orange sky. Maybe I am just tired. Or maybe you are carrying something you think you have to carry by yourself. Ethan wanted nothing more than to tell him the truth, to admit that pretending had become exhausting because every smile, every photograph, and every borrowed wedding ring made it harder to remember this was never supposed to become real. Instead, he simply stood up. I should finish editing tomorrow's photos. Mason watched him walk toward the house, but did not follow. Later that night, after Ethan had gone upstairs, Mason remained alone on the porch with 2 untouched glasses of iced tea. He found himself replaying every conversation from the past few days, searching for the moment something had changed. He could not explain why Ethan's quiet distance bothered him so much, only that the ranch somehow felt less alive whenever Ethan pulled away. For reasons Mason could not yet understand, the silence between them had begun to feel heavier than any words either of them had left unspoken. The following weekend arrived with steady sunshine and a long list of unfinished chores. The festival had brought more visitors than anyone expected, and every corner of the ranch seemed to need attention before the final celebration. Shortly after breakfast, Mason asked Ethan to help clean the old storage loft above the main barn, explaining that years of forgotten equipment had collected enough dust to fill an entire house. Ethan welcomed the distraction. Working with his hands had become much easier than trying to untangle the emotions growing quietly inside him. The narrow wooden staircase creaked beneath their boots as they climbed into the loft, where sunlight filtered through small windows and illuminated countless floating specks of dust. Old saddles, broken lanterns, weathered toolboxes, and boxes that had not been opened in years lined every wall. Mason laughed as he looked around. My father always said he would organize this place someday. Ethan smiled. He probably told himself that every summer. Exactly. They spent the next 2 hours sorting through forgotten memories disguised as ordinary belongings. Mason discovered a fishing rod he had not seen since high school. Ethan found an old baseball glove with both of their initials written inside the leather from a camping trip years earlier. Every object seemed connected to another story, another shared memory that neither of them had expected to revisit. While moving a stack of wooden crates from one corner, Ethan paused. Tucked behind them sat a small cedar box covered with a thin layer of dust. He frowned slightly. I do not remember this being here. Mason stepped closer. Neither do I. Ethan carefully lifted the box. It felt surprisingly light. There was no lock, only a worn leather strap holding the lid closed. Before he could open it, Mason glanced toward the staircase. Would you hand me that toolbox first? I want to fix the loose shelf before someone gets hurt. Ethan nodded. Sure. He set the cedar box on an old workbench and carried the toolbox downstairs, where a delivery truck had just arrived with lumber for the fence repairs. The unexpected delivery turned into another hour of unloading supplies. By the time Ethan returned to the loft, Mason had already finished organizing the opposite side of the room. I almost forgot about that little box, Mason said, noticing it again. Go ahead and open it. Ethan hesitated for only a second before loosening the leather strap. The lid lifted slowly, revealing a collection of carefully preserved keepsakes. Resting on top was a faded Polaroid photograph from their Yellowstone trip years ago. Ethan picked it up with a gentle smile. They looked impossibly young, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a bright blue sky, both laughing at something outside the frame. Beneath the photograph lay a braided friendship bracelet made from blue and brown cord. Mason recognized it immediately. You still have that? Ethan nodded. You made it at the county fair after we graduated. Mason laughed softly. I cannot believe it survived this long. Ethan reached deeper into the box and found 2 ticket stubs from a professional baseball game in Denver, edges slightly bent with age, followed by a folded park map covered in handwritten notes from another road trip. Every item represented a memory Ethan had quietly chosen to keep long after everyone else might have thrown them away. Mason grew unusually quiet. I never realized you saved all of this. Ethan looked down at the collection. Some memories are worth keeping. At the bottom of the box rested a sealed white envelope with no stamp and no address. Only one name appeared on the front in Ethan's handwriting. Mason. Ethan's heartbeat skipped. He had completely forgotten the letter was still there. Years ago, after one particularly unforgettable summer, he had written everything he could never bring himself to say aloud. He had folded the pages, sealed the envelope, and hidden it away, convinced it would never be seen by anyone. Without thinking, Ethan reached for it a little too quickly. That one is nothing important. Mason noticed the sudden change in his voice, but did not question it. Instead, he simply smiled and stepped back. If it is yours, you should keep it. Ethan slipped the envelope into the pocket of his work jacket with careful hands, hoping Mason had not noticed how nervous he suddenly looked. They packed the remaining keepsakes back into the cedar box before carrying everything downstairs. The afternoon continued as though nothing unusual had happened, yet Ethan could not shake the uneasy feeling that the forgotten letter had somehow moved one step closer to the surface. Across the yard, Mason watched Ethan from a distance for a brief moment, wondering why a simple envelope had caused such an unmistakable flicker of fear in his best friend's eyes. And for the first time, he found himself quietly wondering how many stories Ethan had been carrying alone without ever letting him read a single page. By the time the final week of the festival arrived, everyone in Willow Creek seemed convinced that Ethan and Mason had been building a life together for years. The borrowed wedding bands no longer attracted much attention because people had accepted them as part of the story, and strangely enough, both men had grown accustomed to wearing them. Ethan often caught himself absent-mindedly twisting the silver band around his finger before remembering that, in only a few days, it would go back into Linda Harper's velvet box and become nothing more than another prop. That thought should have brought relief. Instead, it left an unexpected emptiness. On Tuesday afternoon, while Ethan was editing photographs inside the visitor center, his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number from Seattle. He stepped outside before answering. After a brief conversation, he thanked the caller and stood quietly beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree. A regional outdoor magazine had seen several of his recent ranch photographs through the festival promotion and wanted to offer him a full-time position. The salary was steady, the benefits were excellent, and the office was located in Colorado instead of Washington, only a day's drive from Montana. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been hoping for after losing his previous career. He should have felt nothing but happiness. Instead, the first thought that crossed his mind was how much he did not want to leave. That evening, Ethan accepted the offer anyway. He told himself it was the sensible decision. He could not build his future around feelings that had never been returned. He would finish the summer, congratulate Mason when the ranch received its grant, quietly return the borrowed ring, and leave before pretending became impossible to separate from reality. He decided not to tell Mason until everything was finalized. Unfortunately, Small towns rarely allowed secrets to stay hidden for long. The following afternoon, Rachel Collins arrived carrying paperwork for the conservation project. As she walked into the barn office, she smiled at Ethan. "Congratulations on the new photography job. I heard the news from one of the board members this morning." Ethan's expression immediately changed. "You already heard? Word travels fast around here." At that exact moment, Mason stepped through the open doorway carrying a toolbox. "What news?" The room fell completely silent. Ethan slowly looked toward Rachel, who instantly realized she had spoken too quickly. "I thought you knew," she said apologetically. Mason looked back at Ethan. "Knew what?" Ethan took a slow breath. "I was going to tell you tonight." Mason waited. "Tell me what?" "I accepted a photography position in Colorado." Mason stared at him for several long seconds. "Accepted?" Ethan nodded. "The offer came 2 days ago. And you already said yes?" "I needed to." Mason's voice remained calm, but Ethan recognized the disappointment behind every word. "When were you planning to mention that?" "After the festival ended." Mason let out a quiet laugh that carried no humor at all. "So everyone else gets to know first?" "That is not what happened." "It sounds exactly like what happened." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I did not want this week to become awkward." Mason shook his head slowly. "You really think leaving without saying anything would have made it less awkward?" Neither of them spoke again until Rachel quietly excused herself and closed the office door behind her. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument either of them had ever shared. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice softer now. "How long were you planning to stay after the festival?" Ethan answered honestly. "1 morning. Maybe 2. Mason looked away toward the pasture where visitors laughed while feeding horses, completely unaware that something fragile had begun to crack inside the barn. "I guess summer really was temporary for you." Ethan felt those words settle painfully in his chest. "That is not fair." "Maybe not." Mason picked up the toolbox again. "But it is the first time all week I have said exactly what I was feeling." He walked out before Ethan could answer. That night the farmhouse felt unusually quiet. They still shared the same bedroom because the guest cabin repairs had not been completed, yet neither of them spoke much beyond simple good nights. Before climbing into bed, Ethan quietly removed the borrowed wedding band from his finger and placed it on the bedside table. He stared at it for a long moment, wondering how something that had never been real could hurt so much to let go. While across the room, Mason lay awake listening to the silence between them, unable to understand why the thought of Ethan leaving suddenly felt like losing the most important part of the home he had spent his entire life trying to protect. The final day of the festival arrived beneath a bright blue Montana sky, but neither Ethan nor Mason noticed much of the celebration around them. They moved through every scheduled activity with practiced smiles, greeting visitors, answering questions, and posing for one last collection of photographs beside the weathered white fence that had become the unofficial symbol of Brooks Family Ranch. Anyone watching would have seen 2 men working together as effortlessly as they always had. Only they knew how carefully every conversation avoided the one subject neither of them could face. By late afternoon, the last guests began leaving. Folding chairs disappeared into storage, and colorful banners were slowly taken down from the entrance road. Linda Harper thanked them both for helping make the festival the most successful in recent memory before collecting the borrowed wedding bands. Ethan slid his ring from his finger with reluctant hands and placed it inside the familiar velvet box. For a brief second, he caught Mason looking at the empty space on his own hand before Mason quietly did the same. Neither of them said a word. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan carried his duffel bags downstairs while Mason disappeared into the barn, claiming he wanted to finish putting away equipment before sunset. Ethan knew they were both simply avoiding another difficult conversation. As he folded the last of his clothes into his bag, his work jacket slipped from the closet shelf and landed on the floor. The sealed envelope that he had hidden days earlier slid halfway out of the pocket before Ethan quickly pushed it back inside. He stared at it for a long moment. 8 years of friendship, 6 years of silent love, countless chances to speak that had all passed untouched. None of it mattered anymore. Tomorrow morning he would leave, and the letter would remain exactly what it had always been, words that belonged only to him. He placed the jacket beside his luggage and walked outside to help load supplies into the truck for one final delivery into town. An hour later, while carrying empty feed sacks into the mudroom, Mason noticed the forgotten jacket still hanging over the kitchen chair. Thinking Ethan had simply overlooked it, he picked it up to bring upstairs. As he lifted it, the sealed envelope slipped quietly onto the wooden floor. Mason bent down and picked it up without thinking. His own name, written in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting, stared back at him. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to place it back where he had found it. Yet another thought refused to leave him alone. Why had Ethan looked so frightened when that old cedar box had been opened? Why had he saved years of memories that even Mason himself had forgotten? Why had leaving suddenly become easier than staying? Mason stood alone in the quiet hallway for several long moments before carefully opening the envelope. Inside rested several folded pages, yellowed slightly with age. The date at the top stopped him immediately. 6 years earlier. His hands trembled as he began reading. Ethan had written about the first summer they spent traveling together after college, about late nights beside campfires, impossible dreams, and a friendship that had quietly become something deeper without permission. There were no dramatic declarations, no demands, no expectations. Only one painfully honest truth written in careful handwriting. I know you may never feel the same way, and that is all right. I would rather spend my life protecting our friendship than risk losing you by asking for something you cannot give. If loving you quietly is the only way I get to keep you in my life, then that will always be enough for me. Mason lowered the pages, unable to breathe for a moment. Every conversation from the past 8 years replayed inside his mind, with entirely new meaning. Every time Ethan had stepped back instead of closer. Every smile that had hidden disappointment. Every goodbye that had lasted just a second too long. The photographs, the friendship bracelet, the baseball tickets, the carefully preserved memories. The way Ethan had agreed to become his fake husband without asking for anything in return. None of it had been pretend for Ethan. Tears gathered in Mason's eyes before he even realized they were there. He was not overwhelmed because his best friend had loved him. He was overwhelmed because Ethan had carried that love completely alone, protecting Mason's happiness at the cost of his own for 6 long years. And suddenly the fear that had haunted Mason since learning about Colorado finally became clear. He had believed he was afraid of losing the best friend who had always stood beside him. The truth was far more frightening. He was terrified because he had only just realized that the person he could not imagine living without had already begun walking away. The next morning arrived wrapped in cool mountain air and the soft glow of sunrise spreading across the pastures. Ethan loaded the final duffel bag into his pickup truck with slow, deliberate movements, telling himself that leaving quietly was the kindest ending he could offer them both. The ranch looked peaceful, almost exactly as it had on the day he arrived, yet everything inside him had changed. He reached into his pocket and felt the empty space where the borrowed wedding band had rested for weeks. It had always been part of a story that was never supposed to become real. He climbed into the driver's seat and rested both hands on the steering wheel, but before he could start the engine, he heard someone calling his name. Ethan. He looked up to see Mason running across the yard, slightly out of breath, holding the folded letter carefully in one hand. Ethan immediately recognized the envelope and felt every bit of color leave his face. He stepped out of the truck without saying a word. Mason stopped a few feet away, trying to steady his breathing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mason lifted the letter slightly. I am sorry, he said quietly. I was trying to bring you your jacket, and this fell out. I should have stopped. I know I should have, but I read it. Ethan closed his eyes for a second before giving a small, defeated nod. I never wanted you to find it. I know. It was never supposed to change anything. Mason looked down at the pages in his hand. Do you really believe that you loved me for 6 years without asking for anything in return? Ethan let out a soft laugh that carried more sadness than humor. I did not think I had the right to ask. Why? Ethan looked across the open fields before answering. Because you were my best friend. You were the one person I could not afford to lose. I kept telling myself that loving you quietly was better than risking a life without you in it. Mason swallowed hard. All this time, every smile, every trip, every summer, Ethan nodded gently. They were all real. I just never expected them to become anything else. Mason took another step closer. Do you know what frightened me the most after I found out you were leaving? Ethan slowly shook his head. At first I thought I was losing my best friend. Then I read your letter, and I finally understood something I should have realized a long time ago. He smiled through eyes that had grown noticeably brighter with emotion. The reason the house felt empty was never because you were helping around the ranch. It was because you were the person I looked for in every room without even thinking about it. The reason I hated the idea of Colorado was not because I needed another ranch hand. It was because I could not imagine building a future that did not include you. Ethan stared at him, almost afraid to believe what he was hearing. Mason reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and carefully pulled out a small, worn leather ring box. Ethan recognized it immediately. "Those belonged to my parents," Mason said softly. "They wore these rings for 38 years. I always thought if I ever gave one to someone, it would mean I was choosing the person I wanted beside me for the rest of my life." He opened the box, revealing two simple gold wedding bands that had been polished by decades of everyday wear. "I spent weeks pretending to have a husband," Mason continued with a gentle smile. "Somewhere along the way, pretending stopped feeling like pretending. I do not know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was fixing fences together before sunrise. Maybe it was laughing over pie in the kitchen. Maybe it was waking up every morning knowing you were only a few steps away. All I know is that when I thought you were leaving for good, I finally understood my heart had already made its decision." Ethan could no longer hide the tears gathering in his eyes. Mason carefully removed one of the rings from the box. "I am not asking because of the festival. I am not asking because of a grant. And I am definitely not asking because of a story we told the town. I am asking because I do not want you to be my fake husband anymore. I want you to stay, if staying is still something your heart can believe in." Ethan laughed through his tears before giving the answer he had quietly carried for years. "Yes, it always was." Mason gently slipped the family ring onto Ethan's finger, and this time neither of them had to pretend what it meant. Ethan placed the second ring onto Mason's hand with a smile that felt lighter than any he had worn before. Around them, the morning breeze carried the scent of fresh hay across the valley. Horses grazed peacefully beneath the endless Montana sky, and the ranch that had first offered Ethan a temporary summer job quietly became the place where two lifelong friends finally stopped hiding behind fear and chose a future built not on silence, but on honesty, trust, and the simple courage to love each other exactly as they were.